everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk. I'm going to talk about live ops, and I work for a team called Amber. Amber is a game development and studio services agency. We've worked with many partners over the years doing development, co-development, quality assurance, dev services, and one of the things that we found is that there is a need these days for teams that have existing free-to-play products to give those free-to-play products to other teams in order to support through live ops. So we are attacking basically service-based live ops very aggressively. We've got a few products that we're managing now, and we're always looking for new products to take over as part of our service offering. So what I'm going to go over for you today is some of our perspective in how we approach these games when we are taking them over. We're going to go over some basics in free-to-play and live ops just to make sure we're on the same page, and then we're going to go through 2 case studies of products that have some strategy towards live ops that I think you might be able to learn something from our live ops playbook, which is a document and a methodology that we use when we look at taking over existing products to optimize them. So Amber has worked with a bunch of different mobile publishers in the past. Some of these teams have used us for live ops, some of these teams have used us for other things, but we've been around since 2013. We have offices in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and our core execution team is based in Bucharest. We're about 280 people strong. So we have a pretty big team tied to servicing some of the top publishers in the world. And the way we really look at offering value to our partners when we engage them on our live ops initiative is to achieve maximum user engagement while lowering the operating costs. So for a lot of these teams, they're live opsing games with 20, 30, 50 people in San Francisco, Los Angeles, other expensive parts of the world. That can be very cost consuming for them, especially as games enter the long tail part of their life cycle, which is usually, with a successful product could be like 2 years, maybe 3 years out. And what we do is we'll step in and we'll say, well, these games are still making money and they're still very profitable for you guys, but let us take them over at a lower operating cost, and while we do that, let us also add value by optimizing them. Because these teams may have been great at live opsing the games in their time, but they may have run out of ideas because they've been doing it for so long. We can come in with a fresh set of eyes, look at a product, and maybe figure out some new strategies to help optimize the user base. The other thing we'll do is maybe we'll come in at a product that's early in its life cycle that never really had the chance to drive value for the service because maybe the team didn't really know how to tackle it, maybe they were making the wrong choices. So the other thing we could do is come in at a product that's maybe been out for a few months and hasn't really been optimized to help drive more value with a new product. Our experience started with Disney in regards to taking over some live ops products. We built a product from scratch for Disney called Cinderella Freefall, and that product has been live operated for over 2 years. And because we did such a good job at operating that product, Disney came to us with 2 products that weren't ours because they either wanted the internal team to move on something more strategic, or in one of these cases, the existing developer got purchased by another publisher. And they came to us to take over the games. So our live ops business really started at Disney because they came to us to help manage some games that they already had up and running. And we've been running all these games for well over a year now. Inside Out Thought Bubbles we've been running since July, and Disney Dream Treats are about the same time. And the other experience we bring to bear when we're doing live ops is some of our co-development experience. So we've worked with Kixeye on War Commander Rogue Assault for 2 years, basically developing components like features, AI, campaign maps, etc. Okay, so that's the background of who we are and why we're sort of in this business and why I'm up here talking to you about live ops. Now, when we look at live ops, what is it? What is it at the end of the day? I think it's very simple. You think about it as running a games as a service is giving your user base something to do every single day. And that doesn't have to be like releasing new content every single day or driving new features every single day. But what it does mean is that you need to bring your user back every single day in order to minimize churn and keep them engaged in the product, which will ultimately, hopefully, drive conversion in your product and drive monetization. So the gentleman that was up here earlier, I'm sorry I didn't catch his name, was talking about watching stuff, right? And I think Clash Royale does a fantastic job of not only driving game content every day, but driving stuff in the product that you can watch or outside the product. So the service itself just means you have to be engaged in that game every day to drive optimum value. Some of the basics to get out of the way as we start to move into some of the case studies, acquisition, retention, and monetization. These are the three legs of the stool that we stand on in regards to live ops. And I'm sure you guys are very familiar with these terms, but the way we think about them is you have to be considering all three of these pillars in order to optimize product. No product can exist, I think, with only one or two of these working. I think they all have to have all three of them working in order for you to have a successful service. And acquisition isn't just spending money to bring users in on Facebook or other channels, but it's also looking at your organic users, right? The people that just come in by searching on the App Store, or who knows where they come in unknown, to understand who those users are, what's their demographic, what are their interests, right? Because if you don't understand your user base and you don't understand the people that you're getting into your product, you're not really going to understand what sort of content or features to develop for them. So I think that's a really important thing to consider in regards to acquisition. Retention is obviously driving engagement, not just short-term engagement, but long-term engagement, making sure that your user base is sticking around, and that's giving them something to do every day is really important to drive retention. And then monetization, if everything goes well, you're converting your user base, they're spending in your product at some percentage, usually around 1% to 2%, and we use ARPDAU, conversion, average revenue per paying user, as key stats to monitor those KPIs. If you're running a product management pipeline, I think you can think of it in sort of these three basic pillars. The first pillar is the assessment of the KPI. So let's say you release a game component or a couple of game features through A/B testing. You would look at that cohort of users, that group of users, when you release that feature, and you would grab game events from that feature, right? So let's say it's a new game through soft launch. Let's say you're in geo beta in Australia and you want to track your first-time user experience. You would track that first cohort. You would track all the game events through the first-time user experience. You would track their drop-off, and then you would start to evaluate where they're dropping off and start to see like how they're going through in the Fatui as an example. After you evaluate those KPIs, the next step is to have your designers and product managers step in to start doing human analysis, because telemetry is going to tell you usually where the problem is, or sometimes what the problem is. It's never going to tell you how to fix it. And the best optimization in live ops I've seen has come from really smart designers and product managers looking at KPIs and understanding their user base, understanding the audience to basically interpolate that drop-off must be because this thing is frustrating them, or that drop-off must be because this thing isn't clear enough, or they're not converting here because our merchandising sucks. So I think that's the next part of it, is taking the KPIs and understanding that you have to analyze your user base in order to optimize it, and then sort of rinse and repeat that cycle And then outside of that cycle, I think there's another pillar which is more long-term, which is thinking about the new components and features that you need to implement into your product in order to drive longer-term value. And these would be things like, new events, or new features, or new game modes, things that you're going to bet on and maybe put into an A/B testing round to try and drive further value outside of the current stuff that you're just engaged in that day-to-day loop of analyzing. When we enter the equation, there's usually a few things that we'll pull from our playbook that we can immediately start to look at. We already talked about acquisition, retention, and monetization, and sort of just starting to take an early look at that through the KPIs. The other thing that a lot of teams don't necessarily get is dynamic difficulty and how to track that. One of our case studies we're going to go over today, we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth at our approach to tracking dynamic difficulty. Another one that I think is incredibly valuable that a lot of teams don't implement are special events or limited time events. That's another case study that we're going to talk about. And then, I think the value that we bring is also because we have a team in Bucharest, we're able to keep our operating costs lower, and we're able to maximize income through other ways, like maybe a game isn't making smart use of rewarded video. Putting a rewarded video SDK in your application and thinking about a way that the user would be incentivized to engage with that rewarded video is a pretty easy thing that a lot of teams just don't get and don't do. So don't underestimate the way, the possibilities of optimizing your income through non-IAP methods and, advertising specifically. All right, so Frozen Freefall. My experience before coming to Amber was I worked at Disney for 4 years. I ran their co-development division. And we also have 2 other leaders from Disney that have come over to Amber to help drive success in our live ops business. So one of the case studies I'm going to talk about is our experience in Frozen Freefall and some of the things that we did on that title to drive success. For you guys that aren't familiar with Frozen Freefall, it is, to this day, the top grossing Disney published mobile game of all time. It's made about $150 million, probably more at this point. At peak, it had about 4 million DAU. Its retention was off the charts. For us, I think it was just one of the most amazing experiences of seeing people just stick around in the service. And we're going to talk about some of the things that we did to drive value in this service specifically. So one of the things that we did to drive retention was, and this may sound elemental, but it's not. You'd be surprised how many people don't do this, is adding new mechanics every time you did an update. So what, at the time, a lot of these puzzle games were doing were just taking existing mechanics and sort of recycling them to create emergent gameplay out of before where it was just blockers, now it's blockers and you got to eliminate the background. And that worked for a while, but what we found was that when you introduce new mechanics into new updates, the audience came back and was experiencing something fresh and new. And that got them to want to come back for every update because they knew, just like if you're watching a TV show when a new episode comes out, that you're going to get something fresh and new that you hadn't gotten before. So I think that was a learning that we had that was really pushed forward from our designers, whether it was the wolves that were moving around to replace the tiles, or whether it was the update where we had Marshmallow and he would come out and he would freeze, or whether it was we added a collection in one update where we never had collections before, and that drove a lot of interest. So when you're thinking about retention, think about ways that you can drive surprise and delight for your user base when they come back for new updates. In regards to conversion, there was a really interesting thing that we did, which started out as a test but became a staple, which was implementing durables into a consumable economy. So for those of you that are familiar with puzzle games, they are a primarily consumable-based economy, and I think to this day most of them still are. And the consumable economy is basically energy, power-ups, anything that you can buy and continue to buy more of, ad nauseum. One thing that we did was we introduced a durable map. So if you had finished the core 200 levels of our game, you could play a durable seasonal map for free. If you hadn't finished the first 200 levels of our game and you still wanted to play that Christmas map or Valentine's Day map, you could do so, but you had to buy it for $1.99. And one thing that we saw that was very interesting is we had unlocked a couple extra percentage points in conversion when we did this, because there were users that had never ever wanted to purchase consumables, because our theory is there's a philosophical outlook of some users where they don't see the value in consumables because they know you're going to buy them and they're just going to use them. But there was a user base that was really interested in buying durables. So we unlocked a whole different new cohort of payers that we hadn't had before when we introduced this feature, and what started as a test became a standard. The final one in Frozen is limited time events. So we implemented our first limited time event around April of 2016. And it was built out Elsa's Ice Castle, and this was a feature that we were testing. It was something that we had borrowed from RPGs and strategy games, but we wanted to test it in a puzzle game, and it ended up driving an increase in 200% revenue in the first weekend that we ran it. And if you look at the decline, and this is App Annie, if you look at the decline of revenue up to the point where we released that first limited time event, that is a spike right there, and App Annie didn't even get the revenue right. They don't always estimate correctly, but you can still see the spike, and then you could see that the team was able to, pretty much every other weekend drive value in those limited time events for the continue of the service, and they continue to do it to this day. And I think to this day, it's still one of Disney's top grossing games daily. All right, so the second case study I want to talk about is Inside Out Thought Bubbles. And Inside Out Thought Bubbles is a game that we took over from Disney as Amber. And this case study is all about rational game design. So for those of you that don't know what rational game design is a theory of game design that's been around for a while. It was made popular within Ubisoft in sort of the early 2000s and was sort of disseminated within Ubisoft. But since then, there's been a ton of articles on it. Recommend you search, if you're interested, search on Gama Sutra. There's a couple of really good articles on rational game design. But basically, the idea is that you can take a scientific and data-driven approach to game design, and where typically design was thought to be a very subjective experience, you've got the creative director stepping in and making his choices based on his gut. Rational game design attempts to take a very objective approach to game design, which is to say, like, if you can balance components like difficulty and mechanics in a spreadsheet to drive maximum differentiation and scaling difficulty, you can create a really compelling progression through your game. So we employ this theory when we're developing live ops games and the content that we release for those games. After we make an initial bet on what we think the mechanics should be, we sort of tweak those, like a soundboard or like a DJ to get to where we want it to be from a perfect standpoint. And then we'll design the levels around those ideas, right? So if we're like, okay, well, this game needs to have a low difficulty, then we'll make it, easy in regards to the amount of colors that you have to pop in the bubbles, per se. We'll put the colors together, and this will be mostly a human-driven success scenario, which means if you're really good at an easy level, you'll mostly be able to overcome it anytime. The second example, to make a level harder, you maybe add more colors, you add more differentiation in sort of the spacing of the colors. You'll add some other components, maybe like blockers or more complex pieces, and that becomes more of a statistic game design implementation, which means that it's not so much human-oriented in your ability to beat it. There's going to be a randomization involved, so there's a little more chance. And generally, when you're playing puzzle games and they're harder, it's because there's usually more chance involved in your ability to succeed at a level. After we do that, we'll release them to the marketplace. Like I said in the product management slide, we'll get back the data, and then we'll start to evaluate the data. So, orange was intended difficulty, and blue is actual difficulty that we got back through the KPIs. So if there was a level in example 1 that was too hard because we want it to be easier level, we're going to start to see users churn out because they're getting frustrated. So we're going to go ahead and make the changes within that level to optimize it, make it easier to keep users around longer. In example 2, the level is actually too easy. We actually wanted it to be a hard level to spike difficulty a little bit, maybe drive some more conversion and power-ups. That's not happening, so we're going to go back into that level, balance that level, and make it a little harder. In example 3, sometimes what we find is that we may have an intended difficulty and it ends up being a little bit harder, but that's actually good because when we look at the stats, we don't see users churning out on that level, which means, okay, we thought it might be too hard, but it's actually not too hard. They're sticking around, and they're converting, so we'll keep that the way it is. This becomes really interesting when you think about the applications that you can use to take this approach to game design and level balancing and difficulty balancing when matched with automation and machine learning. You could conceivably develop a tool set that allows you to balance and redesign levels based on the KPIs that you get back almost autonomously. And that's some of the technology that we're looking at is actually, when we optimize our operational costs, is how do we remove the human element, because humans tend to be very expensive, to be able to add more automated solutions in order to drive value. So those are 2 case studies from our LiveOps playbook. Hopefully you got some value from those, and thank you for coming to my session.
Thank you very much, Scott. You packed a